Hello and welcome to the NGBI podcast. This is Jim Wilson. If I've learned anything since starting down my life sciences path 10 years ago, it's that a surprisingly few number of people have the knowledge and experience necessary to assist companies that need lab space. Jay Levine at Dialog Design was one of the first architects in Toronto to build a practice around the life sciences sector, and he is arguably forgotten as much as some of his peers think they know about lab space design. I had an opportunity to sit with Jay recently and hope you enjoy our conversation. Jay Levine, welcome.
Thanks, Jim. Nice to be here.
Great to have you. Before we discuss your professional career, I'd like to talk about who you are and where you come from. You were born and raised in Toronto, and you're an avid hockey player and fan. What position do you play, and how often do you play?
Well, some would argue that my best position is rover. I think that if you do something long enough, people think you're okay at it. I still play and I enjoy it. My three sons would argue that my skills are less than perfect and pretty mediocre. It's nice to still get out in my early 60s and still get out and have fun once a week.
That's what's important. I'd like to talk about your early years. Your mother was a teacher and artist, and your father was also an architect. I'm guessing you come by your eye for detail honestly, genetically. And could you tell us a bit about your parents and your upbringing?
I also have a sister who's an interior designer, so the apple sort of doesn't fall too far from the tree. Both my folks were creative people, and I think I kind of early on got the sense that if you can think something, if you can dream it, you can draw it, you can make it. And so I love woodworking and making things and assembling things. I mean, even IKEA is still fun for me.
So you went to school at the University of Waterloo, where you received your Bachelor of Architecture in 1986. I would have a tough time answering the question I'm about to ask you. What do you remember about this time in your life back in your university days? And was university fun for you? Was it difficult?
I came from this, relatively speaking, pragmatic background. My father's practice was on modest commercial buildings, and some larger scale would now be sort of design build, distribution centers, and those sorts of things. So in school, I was competing with much, much more creative people. And so I felt myself at odds. There's an old joke in architecture school that the A students always end up working for the C students later on in life. and I felt very much a C student at the time. But maybe that was just indication of slow maturation, because over time, I started to really enjoy my craft and get better at it slowly and bit by bit. It was also a very both competitive, but also everybody was trying to navigate and figure out who they were. It was like early adolescence all over again, except this time in the creative field. It was kind of interesting.
Good answer. I'm going to guess that the tree fort your father built for you is probably better than the tree fort I built for my son.
No, this wasn't a tree fort. This was our family's cottage.
Oh.
It was a standard 60s back split. We were standing on the platforms, just the floors were there, the two floors, and it was only 1,100 square feet in total. But that's all that was up, and it was elevated sort of with the trees around it. I remember standing on this platform in the trees and thinking, this is really cool. Like, to make something like this is amazing. And that's what propelled me to go into this. I realized later in life that my dad was pretty interested in having me become an architect to take over his practice. I didn't feel that at the time, and I certainly didn't understand it.
You started in the industry and eventually ended up at NXL Architects. And the story of that journey is interesting. Our listeners know what an architect does, but you and your team developed a particular focus at NXL. So if you could, please walk us through what that focus is all about and how NXL morphed over the years.
Great question. Architecture is one of those professions that has a wide array of project types and skill sets and so on. And, I joined my dad's practice out of school, and almost right away, we got a project for a pharmaceutical company. And I just remember being really excited and challenged by the complexity of it. It was big. It was, offices and warehouse, but it also was quality control labs and packaging plant, and it had solvent storage, and you had to figure out how to store this stuff. And I thought, this is kind of tough stuff. And I also thought it would be a smart business move to focus or specialize in that stuff. My classmates and schoolmates back at Waterloo wouldn't have been interested in that. They wouldn't have seen that as creative or interesting. So I thought, hey, this is a good thing to do. And it's also challenging enough to give somebody with ADD, a focus for long enough to pay attention for a few minutes. So that's what started it. And I just started then pursuing other pharmaceutical companies and opportunities, and eventually grew that practice with a partner, David Lozon, into NXL Architects, where we focused exclusively on two areas. One was industry, so GMP pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical manufacturing. And the other was straddling into the world of academia, so science and lab buildings for institutions that would generally teach folks that would come out and work in industry. And there weren't too many firms that were able to straddle both.
Huh. And you were how old when you first started to get down this path?
I guess early 30s.
Okay.
Occupier architects said to us back at school, he said, listen, architects only do 5% of the actual buildings, the stuff that gets built in our society. Engineers do the other 95%, roads, bridges. He said, head down that path. It's less crowded.
Huh.
In the end, he was right that this type of specialization isn't for everybody. And I wasn't brave enough to do art galleries and city halls.
The path you've gone down is one that I'm now finding is incredibly interesting from my perspective on the commercial real estate side. And I'd like to look more closely at your journey for our listeners. And one question that comes to mind is, what's the biggest obstacle over the years that you've encountered, and why did it matter?
That's a great question. I clearly remember watching my kids play hockey, sitting next to some developers active in our local community, trying to convince them that labs and laboratory type buildings were where it's at and good things to develop and build, because I was seeing what was going on in the US. So my window was down there, and there were lots and lots of big aspirational projects, and there wasn't anything being done here. And what came back was just no interest. It's too risky. And I think that what I've always found in Canada is a sense of, can't do that. It's too risky. Let's wait for the government to initiate a project, or we got to go see if we can get funding from the government to do this. And what's really fascinating now, and you and I share that same interest, is I think that there's a big turning point, a kind of watershed, where there is a great deal of intellectual interest in science and the impact it has on our lives. And people are starting to pay attention and build for it and embrace it when they used to see it as risk. I think the COVID taught a lot of real estate developers that their office tenants could leave and could work from home. But you can't do your science from home. You can't take your firm home for the weekend.
Yeah.
Some of them are saying it's not risky. There are actually sticky tenancies. Once they've invested and set up, they can't leave.
Yeah. You and your team had a very successful practice at NXL. And in 2021, you folded it into Dialog Design. You had a great brand. Why did you make that decision?
I made that decision because I felt that we had a lot more to contribute. And as the projects were getting larger in scale and larger in aspiration, big companies like to work with big companies. And we had a team of, it varied over the years, as big as 30, but usually hovered around 15 to 20 people. We weren't being seen as or considered for projects of any scale, anything $50, $100 million projects. The only way we could attain those or be part of those was to joint venture with other firms. And every time we did, we ended up only or relegated to the sort of quote unquote technical side, the content. And we were not involved in the container, in the shaping of the building and the architecture of the building. So when the opportunity came up, and it was a pretty funny story about how that happened, but I had somebody reach out to me from Dialog and said they were actually followed up on a reference for somebody that we had recently let go. They said, we've decided not to follow up on this person, but are you interested? And I said, in what? And they said, in joining Dialog. And I kind of stopped and sat down for about a minute, silent, which is not my nature, and said, yeah, actually, yeah. Because I realized at that moment that we were hitting, every day of the week, we were hitting a glass ceiling that we couldn't knock through. And we're never going to at the scale that we were.
Well, as you say, elephants like to herd with elephants and antelope herd with antelope. As you've entered this next chapter of your career, I wonder if how you have defined success has changed now that you're at a larger firm.
Oh, sure. I think that coming to this larger firm, there was a real acknowledgement of the body of work that we had, which was meaningful to me. And I realized we had been successful. You chase and chase and chase, and you're only thinking about the chase. But to look back at it and say, you know what, we had a body of work that was meaningful and give us a kind of good reputation. That was sobering and made me realize that the success actually is in the doing, not the achieving or the getting. The year that we've been at Dialog, we're doing stuff that's, I'm going to say, I mean, it's bigger, but it's also a lot more fun. To be at 60 and having fun again, to me, that's successful.
That's great. I echo that, having gone through my journey and being where I am and having is more fun now than I've had in my career is so refreshing.
Isn't it great? It's like a second life.
Yeah. Let's go back to your comment about the pursuit. What has been your biggest win over the years, and what did it teach you?
There were sort of two, because one's in the institutional world and one's in the world of industry. The biggest win in industry, I saw a little, like a 16th of a page in the Globe and Mail at the time, saying that this company called Hemasol had just been awarded some seed capital. And I called them up out of nowhere and I said, you've just received this money. How much of it do you plan on spending on buildings? And can I talk to you? I set up a meeting with them. Literally, the meeting was standing in their front vestibule talking to them. And that turned into a relationship that grew to build a $120 million biopharmaceutical manufacturing plant that was fascinating and one of our crowning achievements at that point. It was a very small win to begin with, but it grew over time. And then we were competing for a project at York University. And we're competing against some very big brand name firms. And it was for an adaptive reuse of that hockey arena into research labs. And all the other firms were presenting ideas about how to clad it. And I went in there with sketches and I said, leave the brick, build it from the inside. Don't spend the money there, spend the money on the inside. And we got the job. It's actually one of my favorite projects, and it led to 3 other great projects on that campus. So those are 2 big wins, but they didn't start out big. They grew.
Those are 2 great stories. It leads into my next question about making choices. We all make choices in life that steer us to where we are at this moment. And I'm wondering if 3 choices come to mind that you think are responsible for making your reputation what it is today. And I'm going to preface the question by saying you've got an enviable reputation in the field. It precedes it before you get to the room. And I've seen it myself. I'm really interested in knowing, because there is no secret formula, but can you think back to 2 or 3 things that have helped make the Jay Levine in the industry who he is?
That's a pretty heavy and loaded question. I would say, and I don't know if it's 3 choices, it's probably the same choice multiple times over, which is just to say either why not or how come we can't. We had a mandate to renovate a pharmaceutical manufacturing plant that had to stay in operation. And we said, well, why can't we just build up and over it and leave everything inside? And that's what we did. We built a 30,000 square foot penthouse for all the new equipment and built it all completely outside of the existing building and then went inside and basically fed the services down. We did a project at Carleton and we said, well, why do we have to put all the equipment in a penthouse feeding down and cutting up every floor like Swiss cheese? Why can't we take that same equipment and put it on the side and feed it horizontally? I think it's just been the willingness to risk. Maybe it has to do with growing up 5 feet tall and realizing growing a thick enough skin that it doesn't matter what people say. If you don't try, you'll never succeed, never give up. I'm kind of tenacious. That offends some. Different clients feel differently about that, but I can't give up on something.
Being flexible and passionate is part of the package. You've kind of given me a great segue into a question I've been dying to ask is, what's the favorite part of your job?
I love the blank sheet, kind of open possibility, the stage in a project where sit down with clients and help shape what's your vision? What are you trying to do? What do you want? And understanding that, those conversations before there's any design, it's conversations like this one where you get a little bit of an opportunity to get inside somebody's head and say, how can I help you translate your vision into something real? To me, that's the really fun part. I love the front end and the design part of it. The second part is walking through when the thing's finished. There's that moment for an architect where you walk through and you can see it. It's got enough meat on the bone. And, you see your mistakes, but you also see your wins. It's that moment, I think, where you say, this is a good piece of work.
I think that would be the biggest rush.
The privilege of being an architect is that. It takes a village. It is part of the reason for joining Dialog. It's hard work, but I think that walking through it and saying, yeah, people are going to do good things here. They're going to learn great things or create good things.
What is the greatest lesson that you've had to date in your career?
I mean, that's a really potent question, really interesting one. To some extent, everything I learned in life that I needed, I learned in the hockey dressing room about teamwork, that you don't do things alone. We commune in society for a reason, like architecture, design, construction. That act of faith of creating something that takes years in the making to do takes a team. There's a lot of money at stake. There's a lot of liabilities and reputation, and it's all consequential for everybody involved. So I think the greatest lesson is if there's a common purpose and we keep talking to each other about that, we get to achieve great things together. Nobody does it by themselves.
Yeah, I would agree. If you weren't doing this, what would you be doing?
I'd probably be doing real estate development where the creative process is still kind of the same. Seeing value where there isn't, and then figuring out how to bring value to life.
So you'd be at the same table, just at a different seat.
Yeah, actually, that's a great way of putting it. See what it's like on the other side of the table.
For those who may be listening to our conversation, what advice would you give to those scaling life sciences startups from your perspective?
The advice would be hold out as long as you can, as long as it makes sense, but also know when to roll in or connect up with others. One of the partners here said to me, the only regret I have about this whole thing was that it didn't happen 10 years earlier. So I would say to those that are starting up, build, push, connive, beg, borrow, and steal what you need, keep at it. But at a point, recognize when it's going to make sense to hook your wagon to a faster horse, because you can develop so much better results through that synergy.
Office requirements start their plan from the reception, but life sciences requirements start their planning from the loading dock. Why is that?
Life sciences deals with a lot of chemical solvents, equipment that has to find its way to the right place safely. And so you can't fit it through narrow corridors. You can't get it upstairs. Like, it's not like, that Friends episode where they're trying to move the couch up and they can keep flipping it around. These pieces of equipment are multi-million-dollar pieces of equipment. Not only from the loading dock, sometimes you actually have to figure out how they get in the wall of the building. Like, you have to design a demountable portion of the building to be able to move something in. And certainly with the kind of robust mechanical systems that feed these higher performance buildings, you also have to think about the life cycle of that equipment and how you get it out when it is at the end and bring in a new piece. But at the end of the day, you want to get to the right design and mass and material for the building. But you got to make sure that there's high enough floor height to fit the ductwork in and fit the fume hoods in. And for those reasons, the equipment and the materials that people work with are unforgiving, and labs can be unsafe places. They handle a lot of nasty stuff. Designing for safety first, and how keep the dangerous and flammable, explosive, all that sort of stuff in the right kind of safe facilities. Keep them apart from, people who are working in the offices. They're not trained to work in labs.
Mm-hmm. It's not something that a space planner can say, sure, I can do that. The expertise just isn't there. And there are a lot of obstacles in designing proper environments or finding proper environments for labs. Do you see any obstacles on the horizon of your industry at the moment?
Interestingly enough, I think we're at a really interesting time here in Canada specifically, because a lot of those obstacles are falling or giving way, meaning that there is now a fairly robust or a good number of real estate developers who are all looking at investing in the right kinds of buildings to support this industry. So there's now more and more availability of lab space planned to be coming on the market, which means that startups now have some upward mobility and a place to go. For 20 years, the only game in town has been Mars. There's been nowhere for the more mature companies to go. There's been no space for the startups to move into. That obstacle, I think, is falling away. And over the next 5 years, there'll be a lot of space coming online, which means that the companies that are maturing and growing will have place and space to go. And that'll then decant space for new startups to come up. And I think that's really exciting. Because in Canada, we're way better, I think, at doing more with less.
The theme question of our podcast is, what do you see as the next great big ideas on your horizon?
I feared that was coming because I knew it was in the title of the podcast. I think the next great big idea is that clean air is as much a human right as clean water. And the problem is you can see when water is dirty. You can't see when air is dirty. And if you really think about it, the idea of breathing the air in that has been in somebody else's body not too long ago, you start to think about it. It's pretty unpalatable. And so I think we've done ourselves a disservice over the last 150 years of creating buildings, beautiful buildings, great spaces, but not paying nearly enough attention to directional airflow. As a lot of the buildings, developers and real estate owners who own these buildings are looking at how to reinvigorate them for post-COVID use, there's going to be a lot more attention paid to air systems. And the challenge is that the conventional wisdom about how that gets done means very expensive retrofits. And I think we need to look at smarter, more agile, more personal kind of airspace to keep people healthy. Just look what's going on in daycares and in schools. We keep sending them out and they keep coming home sick because they're in classrooms that are not well ventilated at all. So I think that's something you got to fix, but it's not easy. Clean air, wouldn't that be a refreshing sort of idea?
Yeah, no pun intended. And
No.
Yeah, agree 100%. This has been fun. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down with us today.
Thanks so much for having me, and hope there was something worth listening to.
That was Jay Levine, Partner and Life Sciences Practice Lead at Dialog Design. Thanks so much for listening to the show this week. If you enjoyed it, please spread the word by telling someone about the Next Great Big Ideas podcast or post about it on social media. If you'd like to contact the team, our email address is podcast@nextgreatbigideas.com. You can follow us on Twitter at NGBIdeas, and you can follow me at Lab Occupier on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube. And you can email me at jwilson@lennard.com. This episode was produced and edited by Tisha Prasad. I'm Jim Wilson, and you've been listening to the NGB Ideas podcast.